ونصلي ونسلم على رسول الكريم ما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ومولانا محمد وأصحاب سيدنا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم صلاة وسلام عليك يا سيدي يا رسول الله وعلى آلك وأصحابك يا سيدي يا حبيب الله. We started the chapter on the seal of prophethood of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Khatam al-Nabuwah, as it's referred to in Arabic, or Muhr al-Nabuwah as we say in Urdu or Punjabi, the seal of prophethood. And just to recap, last time we mentioned that from most of the narrations what we can gather is that this was roughly the shape of and size of a dove's egg. It was slightly protruded on the flesh of the Prophet ﷺ. Some narrations mention that it had hair on it, some say that it had hair around it. There are even some narrations about having inscriptions on it as well. So there's some different narrations. People have narrated it the way they have sort of understood it. The ulama have given a reason to some of the slightly different descriptions as well, and they've said that the reason for slightly different descriptions is because most of you'll see previously, you've seen the reference to the dove's egg. You've also seen the reference to the button that's in the middle of a canopy. Other references that the Sahaba described it in using examples of certain things, and so whatever they felt was closest in shape and size, they gave that example. So that's why you have slightly differing narrations, but there's not a great deal of contradiction that needs to be reconciled. All of them, if you look at them, they're pretty much similar. So we looked at the first couple of hadith in this chapter. The next one, hadith number 3 in this chapter, is narrated by Sayyida Rumaytha radiallahu ta'ala anha. She's a Sahabiya, and she says that in a lengthy narration, Imam Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala, he's only narrated to us here the section of this hadith that's relevant to this chapter. And the ulama of hadith, they often do this, that when they cite a chapter, and this is what some of the ulama, the shuyukh, say about study of hadith, and in particular books like Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim and so on, the fact that the titles in those books, the titles of the chapters, they serve the purpose of stating the collator's own view about a particular subject, right, a particular topic. And so, for example, raising the hands in the prayer, and so that will state Imam whoever is narrating his view, and then the ahadith that are compiled under that, they will be indicative, or they will go towards proving that stance. Right? And so in some cases where there's a very lengthy narration which they have narrated elsewhere, they will narrate portions of that hadith which are relevant to the topic. And that's what Imam Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala has done here. He's not narrated the entire narration. He's only narrated a portion of this narration, which is that Sayyida Rumaytha radiallahu anha, she says that I was so close to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam at the time that had I wished I could have leaned forward and kissed the seal of prophethood. Right? So she demonstrates that way that she was physically very close in the vicinity of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And she says that I heard the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying regarding Sayyidina Sa'ad bin Mu'az radiallahu ta'ala, that because of his death, the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala trembled. Right? So this is obviously subsequent to the martyrdom of Sayyidina Sa'ad bin Mu'az radiallahu ta'ala. Now, with reference to that hadith about the earth, the arsh, the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala trembling, there's differing opinions as to what is the correct interpretation of that. And some people have said that the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala trembling, that this was out of honor of Sayyidina Sa'd bin Mu'az radiallahu ta'ala. And this Sayyidina Sa'd bin Mu'az radiallahu ta'ala was referred to in this hadith. He's a very prominent Sahabi, and there's many virtues regarding him which are narrated in a hadith. And if we were to go into them, it would take quite some time. And so, just briefly, Sayyidina Sa'd bin Mu'az radiallahu ta'ala, he accepted Islam on the invitation of Sayyidina Mus'ab bin Umair radiallahu ta'ala. He was a young man who was sent by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to go and propagate Islam in Madinah Munawwarah. And that again is a remarkable story. Sayyidina Mus'ab bin Umair radiallahu ta'ala, how the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave priority to the young Sahaba, because he was chosen as the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's delegate to go to Madinah Munawwarah. Even though there were Sahaba who were much senior in age and experience, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam chose him. He's a very handsome individual, came from a very rich and wealthy background, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Sahaba narrate that there are occasions when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam saw him after accepting Islam, because most of his wealth came from his mother. He was from a very rich and influential background. He was always the most sort of beautifully dressed in the city of Mecca, very, very well looked after. But when he accepted Islam, he was cut off by his mother from all of his wealth and so on. And later, when he was seen, he appeared physically to be a shadow of his old self, and this would bring tears to the eyes of the Prophet and the Sahaba as well. Died quite young as well, Sayyidina Mus'ab bin Umair radiallahu ta'ala. And when he died, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam prayed for him extensively when he was martyred. But anyway, this Sayyidina Mus'ab bin Umair radiallahu ta'ala, he came to Medina and he was sent to propagate Islam there. And it was because of his efforts that Sayyidina Sa'd bin Mu'az radiallahu ta'ala, he accepted Islam. And when he did, because he was the leader of his tribe, the whole tribe accepted Islam as well. All of his relatives and the whole tribe, they all accepted Islam. And this was the first entire group or large group or tribe of people to accept Islam in Madinah Munawwarah. Sayyidina Sa'd bin Mu'az radiallahu ta'ala and his people. And he passed away in the 5th year after Hijrah, and he was only 37 years of age at the time. So again, not very old, he was 37. And it's narrated that 70,000 angels came to participate in his funeral. In spite of all of this, there's actually a very serious message in his passing as well, which is that in spite of 70,000 angels descending from the heavens to participate in his janazah, in his funeral, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's throne trembling at this loss or out of honor of Sayyidina Sa'd bin Mu'az radiallahu ta'ala, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, after he'd passed away and after he'd been buried, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam stated, he said, Allah have mercy upon Sa'd, that his grave is tightening around him. For a moment, his grave hugged him and tightened around him. If this is a Sahabi of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, albeit momentarily, but if this is a Sahabi of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then it really puts things into perspective for us. And you look at some of the ahadith, and the Prophet ﷺ tells us from some ahadith, we know that the punishments of the grave, they come from such things that people really are quite careless about, which they probably wouldn't even think about. Backbiting and not protecting yourself from splashes of urine while urinating, things like this, which people wouldn't really pay attention to. So something really seriously for us all to think about that. And it's based on that, Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala, he actually, whenever he would walk past the grave, he would cry uncontrollably. His beard would be wet with tears. And someone once asked, he said, we recite the Quran, there's talk of the hellfire and Allah's punishment and all sorts of very frightening things, and yet you don't cry there, and you walk past graves and you're crying uncontrollably. And he said the reason for that is because the Prophet ﷺ once told me, he said, Usman, this grave is the first step into the Akhirah. For whomever this becomes easy, every subsequent, or whoever passes this comfortably, this test, every subsequent step will become easier for you. And so that's something to consider as well. And going back to the very first of our discussions, the hadith that I mentioned to you about the questions of the grave, about Imam Bukhari narrating only one question of the grave. Throughout the whole of Bukhari, you won't find the narration about 3 questions. Just one question. What did you know about this individual? Ma ilmuka bihadha ar-rajul. What did you know about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? And so it tells us in reality our salvation is dependent upon developing this relationship with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So here, as mentioned before, this is a long narration. The purpose of mentioning that section there is just to give us, tell us about the Khatam al-Nubuwwah, the seal of prophethood. So this is Sayyidah Rumaytha radiallahu anha giving her account of seeing the seal of prophethood. Sayyidina Ibrahim bin Muhammad, who is the grandson of Sayyidina Ali al-Murtada radiallahu ta'ala, he says that when the Sayyidina Ali al-Murtada radiallahu ta'ala would describe the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he would mention the seal of prophethood. And that lengthy narration of Sayyidina Ali radiallahu ta'ala, which was mentioned in the previous chapter, which had mention of the seal of prophethood in it, and he narrates that hadith again. So that hadith has been mentioned in the previous chapter. We've discussed it in detail, so I'm not going to go into any detail there. The next hadith, number 5, is narrated by from Amr bin Akhtab radiallahu ta'ala, who is a Sahabi. He says that once the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he's narrated this to some of his students, the Tabi'in. This Sahabi, Amr bin Akhtab, he narrates, he says that radiallahu ta'ala, that one day the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam instructed me or asked me to massage his back, to rub his back. And so I did. And coincidentally, my hand came upon, my fingers sort of came upon the seal of prophethood, the Khatam al-Nubuwwah. And he says that the student that he's narrating this to, Ilba bin Ahmad, his name is, he says that I asked Sayyidina Amr bin Akhtab radiallahu ta'ala, I said, what do you mean? What was the seal of prophethood? And so he described, he said that this was it was a group of, or it was some hair grouped together on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's back. So this is not a contradiction to what's been narrated before. It's not a contradiction as such. Why he's narrating what he felt with his hand. and he felt the hair, and it is established that there was hair on or around the seal of prophethood, and that's what he narrated, what he felt. So that's his account. Hadith number 6 is narrated by Sayyidina Buraidah radiallahu ta'ala. He says that when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam came to Madinah Munawwarah, Sayyidina Salman Farsi radiallahu ta'ala, he brought something to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this is an account of when Sayyidina Salman Farsi radiallahu ta'ala actually met the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and saw the seal of prophethood. And it mentions the very end of his story. And so I want to narrate for you the complete story, or in some detail, the story of Sayyidina Salman Farsi radiallahu ta'ala. Now, he's known as Salman Farsi. Faris is the Arabic name for Persia, and so Persia was known as Faris, and he came from Isfahan. It's a small sort of village or settlement near Isfahan, which was in Persia. He originates from there, and that's why he has the name Salman Farsi. And so it's narrated that his father was very wealthy. He was very influential in his locality. He owned a lot of land. He had people working for him, and so he also came from very wealthy background. And Sayyidina Salman Farsi radiallahu ta'ala, he narrates this incident himself in detail. So he narrates himself. He told the Sahaba about his journey and how he ended up in Madinah Munawwarah himself. And so that's how we know. This is from his own personal account. So he says that my father was a rich and wealthy man. He was very influential in his time, in his place. And I was very, very dear and beloved to him. And so he was extremely protective of me, wouldn't let me venture very far away from the house, would always try to keep me indoors and in the house, and very protective of me. But eventually there came a time where the workload just actually increased to the point where my father decided to bring me on board in terms of our work. And so one day he sent me out to monitor the progress of our workers on the land. And as I was going, I was distracted en route by a monastery. I came across a monastery. I looked inside and I saw some people worshipping. And he says that we were actually, the people of his village, they were fire worshippers. They worshipped the fire and other celestial bodies and so on. They were pagans in that sense. And he says that I saw these people worshipping, and I was rather intrigued by their style of worship. And the people that he was observing were Christians. And so he then watched them for some time. He went inside, he started watching them and learning from them about their religion. He asked them, "What's your religion?" And they told him about Christianity and so on. And so he got distracted, he got delayed, and meantime, he says, I stayed there till the evening, and my father became very agitated when I didn't arrive home on time. He sent out people looking for me. When I came home, my father asked me, he said, "Where were you all day? What were you doing? Where did you spend the day?" And so I told my father everything. I said, "This is what happened. I became distracted, and I met these people, and I saw how they were worshipping, and I was rather intrigued by it," and so on. And he said that I think their religion is actually far better than ours. I'm quite impressed with what they told me. And his father tried to convince him and say, "Look, this is your this is what we've been following for generations and this is our religion. And he said no. He wasn't convinced. He said no, their religion is better than ours. And so he says that my father began to, at that point, a fear developed within my father that I was going to be drawn away from him. And I was going to be drawn out of my sort of religion of my parents and so on. So he had me put in shackles, and he had me sort of put into captivity inside his own home. He had him put in shackles so that he couldn't escape. Somehow, he says, I managed to get a message to those people, those Christians. And I said, I had asked them, while he was sitting there, he says that I had asked them where their sort of center was in terms of where the majority of their people were, and they told me that the majority of their people and their scholars in particular were all in Syria, in Sham. And so and when we say Sham at that time was the borders were actually much more extensive than they are now. So I think it would have included this whole area of Al-Quds and Jordan and so on, and the surrounding areas as well. But anyway, so he said he told them that this is where most of our people are. And so he says that somehow or other I managed to get a message to those people that if you have any groups traveling that way, let me know. I want to go with you. And so he says that eventually there was a group that was ready to go, and they sent me a message. And again, somehow I managed to break the shackles and get away. And so I went with them, and I arrived in Syria. He says, when I got there, I started to ask around, and I started to ask people that, who is your senior most scholar of your religion here in this part of the world? And they directed me towards one person. And Sayyidina Salman Farsi he says that I went to that person and I said to him, look, allow me to serve you, allow me to live with you, and I will serve you, and I will, I will sort of do what you request. And all I ask in return is that you allow me to stay here and you teach me about the religion. And so he accepted this request, and Sayyidina Salman Farsi he began to live there with him and learn about Christianity. But he says that this person, he wasn't a very good man. He would preach something to other people, and his practice would be contrary to that which he was preaching. So he would tell people to give generously in the way of Allah, to give charity, and when they gave him that charity, he would hoard and save it away and not spend it on the needy and things like this, that he wasn't really practicing what he was preaching. And so he says that as it happened, this person, shortly after that, this person died. And in some narrations, it's mentioned that Sayyidina Salman Farsi actually exposed him as well, or the people found out rather, that when he died, they saw his belongings and they found all their sadaqat that they had given, that he'd stored them away, and they refused to sort of bury him and give him a dignified burial. But anyway, in this particular narration, it doesn't mention that. It just mentions that he died, and then he was replaced by somebody else. And he says, this person, he was a good, pious man. And he was a good man, he was a scholar of the Christian religion, and he was a good, practicing Christian, and he was a good, pious man. And so he says, I stayed with him, I learned a great deal from him, and eventually he too was about to die. And so before he died, I asked him, I said, advise me, tell me what to do now that you're dying. When you die, what should I do? Where should I go? And so he said to Sayyidina Salman, he said, look, in the entire world, I know of only one person who is now following the same path that I am. In other words, someone who is pious and practicing and actually still perhaps a true Christian in that sense. There's only one person, one scholar that I can think of. And so he said to him, go and find him. He's in Mosul. which is in modern day Iraq. And so he traveled from Sham to Iraq. He said, go to him and stay with him. So he went to him, and he had the same experience there. He made the same request. He said, look, let me stay with you, I will serve you, and all I want in return is to learn about your religion. I want to learn from you. And so he accepted, he stayed with him for a while, and again, shortly or sometime after that, this person also passed away. And again, before he passed away, he asked him the same question. He said, guide me, tell me what to do now that you're dying, where shall I go once you've passed away? And so he directed him then, he said the same thing to him. He said, I know of one person who's still following our way and our path, and this person is in Nasibain, as it's pronounced in Arabic, Nusaybin, as it's written now in English, which is sort of southern parts of modern day Turkey. It's still known by that name. It's still located on a map by that name, Nusaybin. So he went there, and again he had a similar experience there, stayed with this individual, learned from him, and eventually he also passed away. Now if you're wondering, this is like the fourth or fifth one that's gone now, is purely a matter of coincidence. The likelihood is that because these were the senior most scholars of their time, all of these people were probably very old in their age anyway by the time he was arriving there. And so he only got to spend perhaps a small amount of time with them. But also, there is also the fact that in some narrations it mentions that by the time Sayyidina Salman Farsi radiallahu ta'ala arrived in Madinah Munawwara and met the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was over 300 years old. So, it's not necessarily that they all died very, very quickly. Considering that he was over 300 years old, he spent a considerable amount of time with each one of them before they died. It was that Allah blessed him with an extraordinarily long life. And he outlived all of them. And so he says that I arrived in Nusaybin. While he was there in Nusaybin, he says that again he asked, where should I go now? And he says that this person told me to go to Amoria, or the modern pronunciation is Amorium, which again you can look up. If you want to trace this route, you can look it up. Amorium. Again, I believe this is still part of modern day Turkish territory. So he arrived there, and again he stayed with that scholar, but this time round he says, when I arrived there, I found some way of earning my keep, or earning my own sort of sustenance and risk and so on, and I began to collect small amount of wealth. And so gradually, he says, I was able to purchase some livestock and other things, and I started to work when I was there as well. Now, the same thing happened there. This one also passed away. And before he did, again he asked him the same thing. He said, guide me, where can I go? Tell me where I can go. This time, he said to him, I don't know anybody in the world who is now following our true path. I can't guide you to anyone else. My advice to you would be that we are now very close to the time of the last and final Prophet and Messenger. He will be coming to Arabia, he will be coming to the land of the dates, and I advise you to go and find that place. Now the Prophet ﷺ's place of hijrah and the Prophet ﷺ's birthplace, in some narrations, Qadi Iyad rahimahullah ta'ala mentions in Ash-Shifa some of the descriptions that are narrated from to have been revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in previous texts in Torah and Injil, in the Torah and the Gospel, in which it mentions that Mawliduhu bi Makkah, this last and final Prophet and Messenger, will be born in Makkah, وَمُهَاجِرُهُ بِالطَّيِّبَةِ. That's one wording, that he was born in Mecca and he will migrate to a land called Tayyiba, or the pure land. In other narrations it mentions the land of date palms. And Madinah Munawwarah was a land of, and still is, a land of date palms. This was their main source of sustenance. And so he described to him what he knew about the whereabouts of where the Prophet ﷺ was going to be born and where he was going to migrate to. And he said, I would advise you to go to that city where he's going to migrate to and wait for him, because we're very close to that time is almost here for him to reveal himself. And so he says that I then whatever small amount of goods I had managed to save there, livestock, animals, other things, I got them together and I started looking for a caravan heading towards Arabia. And eventually he says that I found a group belonging to the famous Arab tribe, Banu Qalb. Banu Qalb is, there's a reference to this tribe in a hadith as well, relating to virtues of certain nights in which the Prophet says that Laylatul Bara'ah, I believe that the Prophet says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgives the number, on this night Allah forgives as many people as the number of hairs on the backs of the goats of Banu Qalb. And so they were famous for their livestock, and famous tribe Banu Qalb. He says, I found a group from Banu Qalb, some traders, merchants belonging to that tribe, who were heading back towards Arabia. And so I said to them, I said, look, take me with you. Take what I have, my livestock and everything else that I've managed to earn, and take me with you. So he offered to pay them with what he had. He told them to take him with him. Before this last priest had died, right, this scholar, before he died, he told Sayyidina Salman Farsi radiallahu anhu not only the whereabouts of where the Prophet ﷺ was going to be born and where he was going to migrate. Now remember, yes, you may not find these descriptions in the modern gospel, the Torah even. But the fact is that we can scrutinize this with the same level of scrutiny that goes into any other hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And this is actually one of the miracles, if you like, or something quite remarkable. It's one of the most remarkable achievements of the modern academic world, is the level of scrutiny that's gone into a hadith. Right? The fact that if you have a chain of narrators, with Imam Bukhari at the end, and there's 6 people in between, and they're narrating from the Prophet ﷺ, he knows every single one of those 6 people. He knows where they were born, he knows where they died, he knows who they studied under, he knows that they all met each other, and he, basically everything about each one of those individuals. And through the work of our Aimma, we too today know that. You bring any chain of ahadith, and it is possible to look up every single person in those chains to find out who he was, where he was born, where he died, who he studied with, what sort of person he was, what his character was like, everything about that person. And so this is a marvel of modern academia, is this branch of the Islamic sciences, Usulul Hadith. So what we can do is we can actually we can apply that here. So for us as Muslims, whether someone else believes it or not, for us this should be something that is completely undoubted. For that reason, but also for the reason that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran. Allah tells us that the Prophet ﷺ was described clearly to them. Right? Doesn't Allah say in the Quran, يَعْرِفُونَهُمْ كَمَا يَعْرِفُونَ أَبْنَاءَهُم? They recognize him the way they recognize their own sons. So very clear and vivid descriptions of the Prophet ﷺ were given in previous texts. And this is the Christian account. Will we'll consider for next time, or when we come to the end of this story or this discussion. If you wish, I can go through with you some of the earliest records of those descriptions of the Prophet ﷺ in the previous text, and it's a rather remarkable subject and a remarkable study. But from both perspectives, there are clear accounts that we have for our own purposes, not for convincing anybody else, but for your own purposes as a Muslim. Very, very clear accounts from both Christian and Jewish sources about these descriptions of the Prophet ﷺ. They're very clear. So he described the Prophet ﷺ to him, as well as not just the locality where he was going to be born and migrate to, but he also described the Prophet ﷺ to him, what he would look like. And amongst that description, he mentioned, he said that he will not eat sadaqah. Anything that's given by way of charity, he will not consume it himself. But he will accept a hadiyah or a gift. Between his two shoulders, he will have the seal of prophethood. And so if you find him, then accept his religion and go to him and accept his religion. So this is amongst those descriptions that he was given. He spoke to these people from Banu Kalb. They agreed. They said, okay, we'll take him. And they took his belongings as a recompense or price for taking him to Arabia. By the time they arrived though, these people, they deceived him, they were deceitful, and instead of letting him go or allowing him to leave when they came to Mecca, they seized him. They took all of his belongings already, they had taken them, and they seized him and they took him into the markets of Mecca and sold him as a slave. And so although he started as a free man, coming from a very wealthy and influential family and background, and then he traveled for what would seem years and definitely decades, traveled searching about Christianity, and then eventually learning about the last and final messenger and about Islam. And by the time he arrived then in Mecca, he was sold in the markets of Mecca as a slave. And he'd lost he'd lost everything he owned, including his freedom. He was purchased by someone from Madinah Munawwara, or Yathrib as it would have been known at that time. This is a Jewish man who had some land in Madinah Munawwara, and he had an orchard, plantation in Madinah Munawwara. And he says that obviously once he purchased me, I had to go back with him. But he says the moment we arrived in Medina, or Yathrib as it would have been known at the time, the moment we arrived there, my heart skipped a beat, because I looked around me and this was the very land that had been described to me by that Christian priest in Amoria, the last one. He described to him very vividly what that place will look like where the Prophet ﷺ was going to migrate. And he says, as soon as we arrived there, I recognized it straight away. And so, yes, obviously the sorrow of becoming a slave, but also the joy of knowing that he was now in that place where the last and final messenger was going to come. And so he started working there, started working in his orchard, in his plantation, until the Prophet ﷺ migrated from Mecca to Madinah Munawwara. And the Prophet ﷺ was staying in Quba at the time. As you know, the Prophet ﷺ arrived after the migration, after the Hijrah, stayed for some time in Quba, and then later the Prophet ﷺ relocated to where Masjid al-Nabawi is now, and the heart of the city of Medina is now. So at that time the Prophet ﷺ was still in Quba, and he says that in some narrations he actually mentions says that I was working. How did he find out? He says that I was working up in the trees. I had climbed into the trees and I was working the trees, picking dates, when all of a sudden this man who had purchased me, his cousin came, and he was very sort of annoyed and really quite shocked, and he was saying to him that have you heard the news? Have you heard about this man who's come into the city and is claiming to be the promised one, the last and final messenger? And when he heard that, he says, I was so happy that I almost fell out of the tree. I came down and I asked him, I said to him, tell me again, repeat to me what you've just said. And his owner turned to him and struck him ferociously across the face. And he said, how dare you talk to us? Go back to your work. So those who came to Islam first and foremost, yes, they have an amazing rank, but they went through some remarkable difficulties as well. With great rank comes great responsibility, but also to get to that great rank, you have to make great sacrifices as well. But anyway, so he says that I found out that the Prophet ﷺ had arrived in Madinah Munawwarah, and while the Prophet ﷺ was still in Quba, I went one day and I had some dates or whatever he had, some consumable edibles, and I presented them to the Prophet ﷺ. I went to the Prophet ﷺ and presented them as sadaqah, as charity, deliberately, that this is sadaqah, as charity. And I noted that the Prophet ﷺ distributed it amongst his Sahaba, but didn't take any himself at all. And then the following day, he says that I went back. And so I went back and I took with me the following day or a few days later, whenever he could, he went back and he took some more. And this time, he went and he said that this is hadiyah, this is a gift from me to you. And he says that the Prophet ﷺ took some himself and then distributed the rest amongst the companions as well. So that was the first description, or one of the things that the priest had mentioned to him. He said, I noted that had come true. So he said the first one, that the Prophet ﷺ wouldn't eat sadaqah, that he took that off first time. Then when the Prophet ﷺ took his gift and consumed some of it as well, he ticked that off his list as well. And then the last one that was remaining was the seal of prophethood on the Prophet ﷺ's back. So he says, in search of that sign as well, I then went to the Prophet ﷺ one day, and the Prophet ﷺ was returning from Baqiyah, the cemetery at Madinah Munawwarah. He was returning from a funeral of one of the Sahaba from Baqiyah. He came and he says that I came behind the Prophet ﷺ and I said salam to the Prophet ﷺ. And as I said salam, I began to walk around. So he came up to the Prophet ﷺ, said salam, and then he says I began to walk around to try and get behind the Prophet ﷺ to see if I can somehow manage to get a look at the seal of Prophet. And he said, without me having to tell the Prophet ﷺ what I was doing and why I was trying to walk behind the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ was wearing he had a cloak or an unstitched cloth as his upper garment. It wasn't a shirt or a qamis that day. The Prophet ﷺ had an unstitched garment, and he says, as I came behind the Prophet ﷺ, without me having to ask, the Prophet ﷺ lifted his cloak and showed me the seal of Prophet. He says that I was so excited, I couldn't contain my joy and excitement. I leapt forward and I kissed the Prophet ﷺ right where the seal of prophethood was. I kissed the seal of prophethood. I was kissing it and I was crying. My eyes were flowing with tears. And just imagine the difficulties that he'd gone through, right down to the fact that he'd become someone else's slave. And eventually, he'd found what he'd gone through all of this difficulty for. And so, he says that I then came to the Prophet who said to me, come, tell me your story. And so he says, I went and I told the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba that were there, I told them the whole story, how I set off from Isfahan and arrived in Madinah Munawwarah. And he says that for some time I then remained this person's slave, and I was busy with all of my chores and my duties. And then one day, the Prophet ﷺ said to me, he said, Salman, why don't you make a contract with your master, your employer, and offer to pay him something in exchange for your freedom. Purchase your freedom from him. And so Sayyidina Salman radiallahu anhu, he went and he said to him that exactly what the Prophet said. He said, let's make a contract. I'll pay you whatever you want, and you set me free. And so he said, and there's different narrations. In some narrations it mentions 100, 200, even 300. But a large number of date palms. He said, plant them, nurture them, and when all of them begin to bear fruit, then you will be free. On top of that, he demanded a large quantity of gold. That you need to pay me this amount of gold, and you need to plant 200 date palms, and when they all bear fruit, then you can go. Then you will be free. So he says that the Prophet ﷺ, I went back and I told the Prophet ﷺ about this. And so the Prophet ﷺ, in some other narrations, it mentions that the Prophet ﷺ then gathered the Sahaba. He said, "O Sahaba, come, let us help our brother Salman." And so the Sahaba all came, bearing small baby date palm plants that could be planted. And they took them all there. The Prophet ﷺ sent and said, go and dig the ground, and I will come and I will plant those trees. And coincidentally, the Prophet ﷺ had received from somewhere a small amount of gold. And he said to Sayyidina Salman, he said, take this, give him this gold. And in comparison, this was tiny compared to the amount that he'd asked for. Sayyidina Salman, looking at the gold, thinking, how on earth is this going to be enough for what he wants? And the Prophet ﷺ said, take it, this will be enough. It was obviously visibly not enough, which is why Sayyidina Salman was worried. If it was almost, then it wouldn't be so visible, would it? And so what I'm trying to say to you, there was a noticeable, visible difference which was upsetting Sayyidina Salman radiallahu. How, now this is where the mind boggles. How can it be that the Prophet ﷺ gives 100 grams of gold and it equates to 1 kilogram when it's weighed? Just giving you an example. How is that possible? That is the nature of a mu'jiza. That's the nature of a miracle. You won't understand it. The Prophet ﷺ said it would be enough, and it was. We don't know how. I can't answer that for you. But that's the nature of a miracle. And so that's how the problem, the issue with this gold was solved. With reference to the trees, the Prophet ﷺ himself went and planted those trees with his own blessed hands. And up until the recent past, this orchard was still there in Madinah Munawwarah, still bearing fruit. Allah guide those who are intent on destroying the heritage of the Ummah. And so, in one narration, there's a rather interesting incident that's mentioned in one narration, is that Sayyidina Salman radiallahu ta'ala, when he went and all the trees were planted, not only did the Prophet plant those trees, but they also bore fruit as well, remarkably quickly. As you can imagine, it would take time for a plant to grow and be of age where it will bear fruit. But it didn't take that time. Remarkably quickly, those plants, all those trees gave fruit. And except, in one narration it mentions, except for one tree didn't give fruit. And so when Sayyidina Salman came back and he told the Prophet that the gold was weighed and it was enough, and all the trees have given fruit except for one, the Prophet remarked, he said, why did that one tree not give fruit? And Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala, he stood up and he said, Ya Rasulullah sallallahu, I planted one tree. And this must be that tree that I planted that's not giving fruit. So we can see how, even Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala, the one from whose shadow the shaitan flees, ash-shaytanu yafirru min zilli Umar. The Prophet said that the shaitan flees from the shadow of Umar. The great Umar, who is a beacon of justice in the world even today, does not equate himself to the Prophet and you can draw your own conclusions about those 1400 years later, those who are trying to equate themselves to the Prophet or say that he was just a mere bashar or mortal just like us. He was bashar, there's no doubt in that. He was human, but like none other. Absolutely. There's no doubt in the fact that the Prophet was human, but like none other. The best of creation, the perfect being, far from like any other. And here I can't go on without mentioning a narration which Imam Nabhani narrates in Hujjatullahi al-Alameen. His sort of work on miracles of the Prophet ﷺ. He narrates about a family in Madinah Munawwarah, and the patriarch of that family, he went away somewhere, father, and meanwhile his daughter was bringing their goat to the Prophet ﷺ and asking the Prophet ﷺ if he would honor them by milking the goat for them. And it's remarkable, how the Sahaba, they came to the Prophet ﷺ with all sorts of issues and problems. There's a narration in Shifa of Qadi Iyad in which it mentions that there would be a line of young children, girls and boys, early Fajr time in the morning, would be bringing their pots of water to the Prophet ﷺ and asking the Prophet ﷺ to dip his hand in the water. And they would take that water back and they would use it and seek barakah, blessings from that water. And then this as well. And the hadith mentions that the Prophet ﷺ asked them to bring the largest container that they had, much, much larger than the normal yield of milk that you get from a goat. Much larger. And the Prophet ﷺ would milk the goat and fill it to the brim. And then when the husband or the father, the patriarch of that family, when he came back the following day, he decided to milk the goat himself. When he milked it, they got normal yield, much less than before. And so his wife said to him, what have you done? You've broken our goat. And his response is remarkable. He asked him, he said, before you start sort of accusing me, tell me who was milking this goat before? And she said, the Prophet ﷺ. How could you ever imagine that I would milk the goat and you get the same yield as the Prophet ﷺ. So it shows you the belief of the Sahaba about the Prophet ﷺ and equating themselves to the Prophet ﷺ, very clear. Anyway, so eventually it mentions in some narrations then that the Prophet ﷺ went back, replanted that one tree that wasn't bearing fruit, and instantly it gave fruit. And Sayyidina Salman Farsi radiallahu anhu was then set free. So it was Sayyidina Salman Farsi radiallahu anhu who, because of whose it was his idea in the Battle of the Trenches to actually dig the trench. He was famously known for that. He was so dear to the Prophet ﷺ, and perhaps one of the reasons was the difficulty that this man had endured in getting to the Prophet ﷺ. But he became so dear to the Prophet ﷺ that the Prophet ﷺ would often say that Salman is from the Ahlul Bayt, is from my family. He would refer to Sayyidina Salman radiallahu anhu, Salman minna Ahlul Bayt, Salman is from us, he's one of the family. So what's the narration then that Imam Tirmidhi narrates, going back to the original narration then? Buraidah bin Husayb, he narrates that Sayyidina Salman Farsi radiallahu ta'ala, he came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and he had a spread with him, some food. There was some dates on that spread. And the Prophet, he gave them to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam asked, he said, Salman, what are these for? And he said that this is charity. And so the Prophet ﷺ said, I don't consume charity. So he gave them, he said, take these away and give them to the Prophet ﷺ said, give them to the Sahaba, and they were distributed amongst the Sahaba. And the second day he came back and Sayyidina Salman radiallahu anhu brought some more dates, and he said to the Prophet ﷺ, this time when he asked, he said, this is hadiyah, it's a gift. So the Prophet ﷺ said, he left it where it was in front of him and he said to the Sahaba, come, join me. And so the Prophet ﷺ ate as well and the Sahaba ate as well. And so it's mentioned by Imam Bajori, who's a commentator of this book. He says that Sayyidina Salman radiallahu anhu doing this on both days, this in reality, this was Sayyidina Salman radiallahu anhu testing the knowledge that he'd received from that priest. And he was himself a very old scholar of Christianity. And here he mentions that according to some narrations 250 years, and according to some narrations 350 years of age. So blessed with and it's like, when I read that first time, the first thought that came into my mind was, what a remarkable individual. It's like Allah chose him, because look, in our times people don't live that long in our ummah and around that time. And so the first thing that came to my mind was 350 years. It means that this man was chosen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to live that long and have the honor of meeting the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so Imam Bajori, he says that he had studied the previous texts and he'd seen that this was a sign, and then he relates those descriptions that Imam that I mentioned to you previously, that Sayyidina Salman radiallahu anhu himself mentioned. And so the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, in this narration, he says that Sayyidina Salman radiallahu ta'ala saw the seal of prophethood on the Prophet's back, and he accepted Islam. And then he mentions that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam told Sayyidina Salman radiallahu ta'ala. In this narration, it mentions that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam purchased, whoever's narrating this, he says that Sayyidina Buraidah radiallahu ta'ala, he says that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam purchased Salman Farsi radiallahu ta'ala. In reality, the Prophet didn't actually purchase him outright, but the fact is that the Prophet was the one who told him to go and draw the contract with his master. And then it was the Prophet ﷺ who gave him the gold, and it was the Prophet ﷺ who planted all of those trees. So you can understand why he said that the Prophet ﷺ purchased him and set him free. And so in this narration, as we mentioned before, difference of narrations, 200 or 300 date palms, the Prophet ﷺ planted himself. And he says that by way of miracle, they gave fruit that very year. Right? Not several years later, but that same year, all of those trees gave fruit. And in this narration, this very narration in the text of the Shama'il al-Tirmidhi, this is the narration in which it mentions that all of them gave fruit that year except for one. And then the Prophet ﷺ asked, he said that, what happened to that tree? Why did it not give fruit? And Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala, he said, upon inquiry, it was understood that Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala had planted that tree. So the Prophet went, took it out, and replanted that tree, and by way of miracle, even though it wasn't the season for dates, right? There were no dates on any other trees. By way of miracle, the dates, the tree gave fruit immediately, instantly. And Sayyidina Salman Farsi was set free. That narration concluded there. We might as well finish off. There's two very short narrations that finish this chapter, so at least we can finish at the end of the chapter. The next narration is narrated by Abu Nadra, who says that he heard from Sayyidina Abu Sayyid Khudri radiallahu ta'ala. He asked him about it, and he said that this was a protrusion of flesh on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's back. That's how he narrates the seal of prophethood. Sayyidina Abdullah bin Sarjis, he says that I came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had a gathering around him at the time, and I walked around the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, went to his back, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam understood why I was doing this, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam took off his cloak, and I saw the seal of prophethood between his two shoulders, and I saw sort of beauty spots all around that seal of prophethood, and again, size of a small dove's egg or similar, and I came in front of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and I requested to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In fact, he says that he recited similar words to what Allah has used in the Quran, لِيَغْفِرَ لَكَ اللَّهُ مَا تَقَدَّمَ مِنْ ذَنبِكَ, and that Allah has forgiven. But we believe that the Prophet ﷺ would have no sins to be forgiven anyway, and so the sense that's understood from this is that Allah, or one interpretation of this, that Allah has forgiven for your sake those before and after. But anyway, he used similar words, and then the Prophet ﷺ prayed for his forgiveness as well. And that's that narration. So that's the last narration in that chapter. I'll just mention one thing to you. It's not good to break habits. Prophet said best of action with those that are done continuously. So to keep our schedule or our practice going. About socks, and this is often an issue that's raised, especially in the university campus environment and also at work and so on as well. People have issues with doing wudu, and one of the excuses for not praying is not being able to do wudu or washing the feet in the sinks and so on. There are modern alternatives available now. It is entirely permissible and very well founded upon many ahadith that it is permissible to wipe over khuffain, which is the Arabic word for leather socks. When we say leather socks, technically in the Hanafi madhab there are certain requirements. They need to hold themselves up without being tied with laces, and they need to be firm enough to be able to walk a certain distance in comfortably. They need to not be porous, they should not allow water into them, and so on. If these conditions are met, then that classifies as khuffain. You could do masa. The method of doing masa is use these 4 fingers and wipe from the toes back towards the heel on top of the foot. So the top of the foot, wipe from the end of the toes back towards the heel with the 4 fingers on both sides, and that's it. You don't have to wash your feet. You don't have to be putting your feet in the sink. And nowadays there are modern alternatives available where you don't have to walk around with the actual leather socks as well. There are, I don't know what they call, but I'm sure if you search you'll find them. There are socks that have been passed by ulama because they fulfill that criteria. I think maybe they're a product for hiking or walking or whatever, possibly. But they have been passed by ulama as fulfilling all the criteria that is required for khuffain. They're just like normal socks. So you can wear them comfortably in these shoes. So that's not an excuse. But I've also been asked the question, in that situation, can you do masa on your feet? No, you can't. You have to wash your feet. Right? Your wudu will be invalid if you do masa on your feet or even on your normal socks, because they don't fulfill majority of the criteria. So if you're in that situation where you feel that pressure, then get some of those socks.